So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could please ask everybody to start taking their seats, and if I could also request that you put your phones on silent. We are about to begin this afternoon's program. It's so good to see so many of you here this afternoon, what is a very, very busy week here in Washington. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Vice President for Communications and Policy Outreach here at the Center for Global Development, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here for the launch of this joint report between CGD and IRC called Refugee Compacts Addressing the Crisis of Protracted Displacement. To mark the report launch, we have an incredible panel, an eminent panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we'll be hearing from them later on, as well as the presentation of the report that the two lead authors will give to us. I want to say hello to everyone obviously in the room, but also those of you who are watching online on the live stream on our YouTube channel. We will be having time for questions during this session, and so I'll be calling on people in the room, but also if you're watching online, please do leave a comment in the comment section at the bottom of the live stream or the YouTube channel page and leave your question in there. We have someone monitoring and we'll hopefully try and get to those as well. We'd love for you to tweet during this event. The hashtag is CGD Talks, usually on the screen, not at the moment. CGD Talks, our handle is at CGDev, and you can leave a question on the Twitter feed as well. We'll be monitoring that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to invite CGD's President, Masood Ahmed, to get us underway. Masood.
Thank you. Here
you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to take a minute before the presentation to say that I'm really very happy about this particular event. We're doing a lot of events during the course of this week, and three reasons for it. One is that this is a joint effort by two think tanks, or one focusing on the humanitarian side, the other on development. And to me, this is a very good example of what we actually need to do, which is to bring the humanitarian and development work together. So I'm really happy to my colleagues on both IRC and CGD who have put this together. Second reason is that if you think about last year, one of the things that happened in the face of this enormous challenge about of refugees and how best we could deal with the combination of humanitarian and development needs they faced was innovation. And I really want to commend the work that was done under the leadership of the World Bank last year to try and come up with new instruments to try and bridge that gap, to not just address the immediate needs, but under this concessional financing facility to try and then go beyond that into the development agenda, and also to then try this out through country compacts. And if you think about it, Imad Fakhoury is going to be on the panel, and I remember very well his leadership in Jordan and that of colleagues in Lebanon in taking that agenda of a country compact and trying to use it to advance the discussion and the delivery of assistance. And the final reason is that, it's a year and a bit, but it's always useful after you innovate to be willing to learn from the early experience. So here we are, a year and a half later, looking back at how that first experience with country compacts worked. Where can we learn from it in terms of things to preserve? And what is it that we need to address so that our collective response going forward is going to be even more effective in addressing the needs that are going to be with us for some years to come? And there are not many examples of a willingness of the institutions to want to learn from experience early in the game so that they can basically improve their effective delivery going forward. So collaboration, innovation, and a willingness to learn are all things that I would like to see much more of in many of the panels we organize, but today is a great chance to benefit from them. So let me now turn to the two lead authors and the co-chairs of this working group, Nazneen Ashen and Cindy Huang, to make a presentation of their findings, about 10 minutes, and then we'll go on to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. We benefited tremendously for so many of the experts in this room on our study group, country representatives, innovators, thought leaders, and we're so excited to share the results of that collaboration with all of you today. Our inquiry was inspired by the global leaders, including those on our panel today, who are bringing solutions to the table to address today's urgent and disruptive displacement challenge. That challenge is framed by 4 facts. First, the historic scale of displacement, 65 million displaced, 21 million of whom are refugees. Second, the fact that given unresolved conflicts in their countries of origin, that refugees are displaced for an average of 10 years. And if you're displaced for 5, that average increases to 21 years. Third, that the vast majority of refugees are no longer sheltered in camps. They're settling alongside host communities, largely in urban centers. Finally, that 88% of refugees live in low and middle income countries that struggle themselves to provide for their citizens. The challenge is compounded by the mismatch of current tools and approaches with these trends. Humanitarian assistance is typically short-term, it's unpredictable, it's focused on basic inputs like food, water, and shelter, when what's needed is the means to survive, but also the means to recover and rebuild, including jobs, including education for children. I think it's telling that given that 2/3 of refugee children are out of school, less than 2% of humanitarian financing addresses this critical need. Humanitarian assistance also typically bypasses host country systems and structures, when it's these structures that are being stressed by current trends and these structures that must be supported to extend what's needed for refugees. At the same time, typical development assistance to host countries doesn't address refugee needs or these stressors on country systems. National development plans often exclude refugee populations, either directly or by default. Refugees are quite literally stranded in this humanitarian and development divide. The World Bank and its visionary host country partners have offered a game-changing new approach, providing long-term financing to host governments to expand economic opportunity and social services for both refugees and host populations. And the great potential of this new approach cannot be overstated. The task now, though, is to ensure that these new partnerships deliver on their intended results, with the measure of success being whether refugees and host populations are able to thrive together. We focused on the early lessons for our report on the Jordan and Lebanon compacts agreed to last year, and found that while financing is critical and has filled an extraordinary need in this context, it remains insufficient. That how that financing is used, the decision-making processes and structures that support the use of financing and drive its decisions have a lot to do with whether these new financing streams are going to be successful. Our report highlights 3 principles to drive success, which together basket our 10 recommendations, which we'll go through briefly. I'm going to talk about the first of these, balancing the needs of refugees and host communities, and Cindy will talk about the rest. There are 3 principles that anchor our report, are the need to balance refugees and the needs of refugees and host communities, ensuring that results are delivered for both along a continuum of shared outcomes. That data, evidence, and innovation is improved to help drive outcomes and find solutions in these new contexts. That we need to strengthen and align incentives to achieve results. So first, on balancing the needs of refugees and host communities in this effort to achieve shared outcomes. Refugees often face legal and policy constraints that constrain their opportunities and create risks. Those constraints are politically sensitive. They carry costs for host communities as well, as refugees are pushed to the margins. We found that more rigorous attention to addressing these barriers and their costs can help overcome policy constraints, political constraints, and identify pathways that will maximize the benefit for host and refugee communities. But doing so is in and of itself sensitive, and our solution was to identify process requirements, rigor that you can introduce into the decision-making process for financing that helps different stakeholders come to the same conclusions about the best use of resources. Doing so begins with defining shared and measurable outcomes. That would be thinking about not just work permits, but also about jobs and increase in income, not just access to education, but also improvements in literacy, numeracy, and social emotional skills for target populations. These become the organizing principles for how stakeholders assess the problem and consider solutions. Standardized assessment tools conducted jointly with host governments have shown promise in diagnosing the key constraints to achieving outcomes and guiding solutions. The bank is practiced in this, and there are many other models to draw from practitioners in these refugee and host country contexts. A portfolio approach that balances short and long-term interventions can help support early successes and the urgent needs of target populations. In Lebanon, for example, the compact may have prioritized community-based education to meet refugee children where they are and to address their unique needs, alongside investments in Lebanon's formal education system. In the Jordan Compact, the formalization of home-based businesses could have been prioritized, even as investments in special economic zones supported opportunity for inclusive and broad-based growth. What's challenging for these new relationships is that they are not typical bank-client relationships, and they also fall outside of the typical government-citizen accountability structures. It requires bringing together a different set of stakeholders to ensure that the needs of all populations are met. And so we propose a multi-stakeholder governing board led by host governments, but including stakeholders from refugee, host government, and donor communities. I'll turn it over to Cindy. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Our second principle is, as Nazni mentioned, to improve data, evidence, and innovation to drive outcomes and get the most value for money. And in this basket, we have two central recommendations. The first is to create a data and evidence alliance. Now, data and evidence, of course, are key to sound decision-making, but there are still significant gaps, especially with respect to refugees and host populations. Where we do know what works, we need to systematically incorporate evidence into program design. So, for example, there is strong evidence that cash grants are extremely effective in business startups. In Jordan, while the compact includes really important reforms to enable refugees to register their businesses, these were not complemented by cash grants. And so we propose, again, the systematic connection of the evidence base to program design. This Data and Evidence Alliance would create guidance and protocols for data collection and sharing. It would conduct these systematic evidence reviews and create standards for cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. Our second recommendation is to dedicate a proportion of compact or program funds for innovation, and this is precisely because of the dearth of evidence and the dynamic displacement context. These funds should have an emphasis on partnering with the private sector and local governments. For example, NGOs are partnering with companies to create jobs for refugees and host communities in the gig economy and business processing outsourcing, in areas such as translation services and customer service centers. Our third principle is to strengthen and align incentives to achieve for results. Our main recommendation here is to make greater use of pay-for-results mechanisms as were used in the Jordan and Lebanon compacts. This strengthens and aligns incentives by placing a greater focus on outcomes or on the policy changes needed to achieve those outcomes. And you can also link disbursements to key benchmarks, as in the Lebanon Compact, where disbursements were linked to improvements in the education data system. And secondly, we recommend the use of beyond aid tools, and there's a fantastic example in the Jordan Compact where EU trade concessions are an essential component of the compact. We know that many of these recommendations reflect best practices in aid effectiveness and more broadly in development and humanitarian programming. What we feel is and can be game-changing is pulling together these recommendations in compacts, which are a systematic model with clear requirements and direct accountability. And there are three main reasons we think compacts are particularly well suited to help address the forced displacement crisis. The first is that compacts gather humanitarian and development expertise, resources, and actors under the umbrella of host country leadership and aligned against a set of shared outcomes. The second reason is that compacts use a common analytical and results framework that Nazanin mentioned and a set of process requirements to build consensus around programs and policy changes. Negotiations around financing, any financing, are inherently political, and we feel that these process requirements can help depoliticize discussions by keeping focused on the agreed upon goals and evidence-based methods. Finally, compacts strengthen incentives for policy reforms. They offer significant multi-year financing and beyond aid incentives. And this combination of incentives with multi-year plans for tracking results and accountability create mutually reinforcing and mutually beneficial commitments. There's, of course, much more in the report, which we hope you will read, or at least take a look at the brief. And I just want to close by thanking IRC for this partnership, our august panelists, the study group members, the report writing team, Janine Madan, Lauren Post, and Madeline Gleave, as well as the production team, and all of you for being here today. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you to Cindy and Nazanin for taking you through the basics of the report. We're going to reset the stage, and I'm going to invite my panelists, please, to join me on stage now that the chairs have been set. So good to see so many people tweeting about this already. Let's keep it going. CG Talks is the hashtag. Let's see if we can trend in Washington today. You've all got copies of the summary of the report on your chair. I urge you to go to cgdev.org. On our homepage is the interactive brief, which is fantastic, which is definitely worth your time exploring and playing with some of the interactive graphics and charts there and the infographic that we designed. So we have our panel. Let me introduce them to you, although I'm sure none of them need introductions. Imad Fakouri is the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation at the government of Jordan. Kristalina Georgieva, the new CEO of the World Bank Group's main lending arms, the IBRD and the IDA and IDA. And David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, bring expertise and different perspectives on this problem and also, hopefully, the discussion of the solutions. So, panelists, thank you very much for joining us. The way this will work, I'll start off by asking you each one question, give you a couple of minutes to answer, and that'll kick us off. And then we'll go to kind of the panel discussion. I know none of you will be shy, but you should not wait to be asked to contribute. Just jump in. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions from the audience here in the room and those watching online as well. So, Minister Fakouri, let's start with you, if I may. Jordan, since 2011, has absorbed more than 1 million Syrian refugees. In fact, you just were earlier telling me some of the latest numbers, so I'm sure you'll share those with us in a second. But I want to get a sense from you of what that means for Jordan. What are you doing to support those refugees? And what are some of the biggest challenges you face?
Thank you, Rajesh, and thanks to the IRC and the Center for Global Development for hosting us. For Jordan, I think for us to understand what we're talking about, it's very important to understand the context, the time, and the scale of what we're facing. So for the Jordanian case, we're a country that has about 9.5 million people, 6.5 million Jordanians and 3 million non-Jordanian. This is based on our population 10-year census that was conducted at the end of 2015. We counted about 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan. Only half of them are registered with UNHCR. And out of the total number of Syrians, 90% of them are outside the refugee camps, or about 80% of the registered refugees are outside the refugee camps. This is basically 13% as a ratio to the total number of population living in Jordan, or 20% as a ratio to the Jordanian population. Think in America, if you had about 66 million or more cross the borders of the United States, or close to 13 million cross the borders of the United Kingdom, or 100 million cross the borders of the EU. That would be the scale of comparison, but that doesn't factor in the per capita income difference that we have to deal with. where it's about 10 to 20 times more on average, depending on which country you're talking about. So we have 1.3 million Syrians that have been absorbed in the nation that can't go back. It's now 7 years as a protracted nature of the crisis. We used to be the 5th poorest country in water availability. We just dropped to 2nd. So you understand this well. We give Syrians water by taking away water from Jordanian citizens, because there isn't a switch where we turn it on and get new water resources. We are absorbing Syrian boys and girls gladly in our schools by running schools at double shifts and scrambling around and trying. But that impacts the quality of education for Jordanian students and their parents and creates the challenges. We've seen about 1.1 million health visits, from surgeries to our hospitals, from Syrian refugees over the past 5 years. That's a tremendous number of additional burden on the public health system, which was barely keeping up with the needs of our own citizens, and you throw this into the mix. Roughly, the crisis, according to the numbers that have been documented by the World Bank, the UN agencies, is costing us directly in costs about, up to the end of last year, $10.6 billion. Remember, we're a $38 billion economy, and our government budget is about $15 billion. So this is quite significant. On average, it's about 20%, between 16 to 20% annually in terms of direct costs of total. And indirect costs, UNDP did a study recently, it's about 3.1 to 3.4 billion annually. So the indirect costs are even outweighing the direct cost of this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Christine Georgieva, I'm just going to come to you in 1 second to give us the development perspective, but David Miliband, from the humanitarian perspective, what are some of the key areas the humanitarian community can respond more effectively to the kinds of things we're hearing from Minister Fakouri, and how has IRC been leading on that?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and real thanks to the CGD for the partnership that has been established. I was taught at university that the most important thing is to challenge the question when you're faced with a difficult one. And I think that to split Kristalina and I into a humanitarian answer and a development answer goes completely contrary to the spirit of this report. That's not just a prelude to me asking her to answer the difficult question, but I'm happy to address it. But I think it's really important to take on board this point that the language is symptomatic of the, to use an undiplomatic word, mess that exists in the way the global community is responding to these crises. Because remember, humanitarian is often equated with emergency. Emergency is often equated with short term, but these are people who are out of their own countries for 10 years on average, 21 years if they're out for more than 5. We in the so-called humanitarian sector, we use development techniques. Randomized control trials are thought to be a development technique. We're proud to use them. We're increasingly embracing issues of economic livelihoods in our outcome framework. So I think it's not just a sort of knock at you, Rajesh, to say beware the idea of a humanitarian answer and a development answer. We've really got to avoid imprisoning ourselves, because I feel that, to directly answer your question, one of the biggest problems we've got is that we've got these different silos and different institutions and different financing mechanisms that are organized for the convenience of the donors, not for the efficacy and impact of the programs. And I don't just say that as a rhetorical riff. I really feel it seriously. Second point, and related, as someone who's relatively new to the humanitarian sector over the last 3 years, the biggest challenge that I think we've got is that historically it's been a social service sector designed around camp-based living with a preeminent focus on keeping people alive. Whereas when you're talking about long-term displacement in increasingly urban settings, Imad Fakouri's point, about 90% of Syrian refugees in Jordan are in urban areas, you can't have a sustainable social program that doesn't also recognize the importance of economic livelihoods. And putting the economy, it's almost like we've got a one-winged aeroplane and we need to develop the second wing, which is an economic wing of the humanitarian effort. And I think that it's really, from an IRC point of view, as we developed what we call our outcomes framework that governs all of our country programs, it was very important to me that one of the outcomes that we put in there alongside survival and health and education, is income. Because there isn't going to be a sustainable 10-year program that doesn't also have a very strong economic component. So the second thing I'd say to you is, let's really build in the economics in a really core way, and let's honor what's said in the principles document here, that it's got to be for the host population as well as for the refugee population, because it's true that poverty rates among Syrians in Jordan is 70 or 80%, but it's also true, correct me if I'm wrong, Imad, that the unemployment rate among Jordanians is 26%.
The youth. Yeah.
The youth unemployment. So if we're thinking about an economic program that is addressing refugee needs, which we should, and refugee jobs, excellent, but let's not forget that there are Jordanians, significant numbers of whom are out of work as well. And to avoid giving a sort of hour-long lecture, just the third thing that speaks to those first 2 points, I want to call out something that's in the report, which is to really think about evidence. And I think many of you will be thinking about big macro studies of the Jordanian economy or the Lebanese economy or the Kenyan economy. I want to call out the importance of real micro-level evidence about what really makes a difference. And I just want to give you an example, because Imad Fakhuri's government does have, and the companies that are based in Jordan have the advantage of tariff-free access to the European market if 15% of their employees are Syrian refugees. So there's a special dispensation there. But only 4% of Jordan's exports go to the EU at the moment. So there's a real opportunity, but there's a real challenge. One of the challenges is overcoming the barriers that prevent Syrian refugees getting into the work. And surprise, surprise, those barriers involve many of the things that people in the Western world take for granted as being barriers to employment. So childcare, security of the family, interruption of benefits, the danger of losing public transport. And the evidence that we need to generate to develop this economic wing of the aeroplane has to be very micro and very tuned to the human stories of the people that we are talking about. Because just to finish, the greatest danger of this refugee crisis is that the sheer scale of it leads to a dehumanization of the population. I mean, 65 million people is a huge number, 21 million refugees, 3.5 million asylum seekers, so 25 million forced displaced across borders, 40 million IDPs. The great danger is that we lose the human scale. And my third point would be, let's really take seriously the need to honor the human stories at the heart of this. Otherwise, we're not going to develop the policy instruments that really work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yep. David. And thank you for correcting me in my sloppy use of language there. As you see, by being David's punch bag, he has so eloquently explained the problem, that we need to bridge this divide between humanitarian and development. Christine and Georgieva, with that in mind, and also building on what the other speakers have said about build in the economics, the World Bank got into this space last year. You made landmark financing commitments to countries hosting large refugee populations, including concessional financing for middle-income countries, which is a big step. Why do you think the bank's entree into this area is crucial to the development agenda?
Well, when we have a former first diplomat of the United Kingdom of all countries getting rid of diplomatic language, I feel free to speak up. And I will start by saying that if displaced populations, be it in their home countries or across borders, are deprived of their dignity and means of existence, that is hugely a failure of development. Therefore, there is no way for an institution like the World Bank that prides itself of standing up for the case of those who are deprived of development opportunities to just ignore this issue and say, not my problem, not my mandate. That is so very obvious. And it is actually the only thing that is amazing is how come it has taken that dramatic crisis to face the obvious and call it as it is. There is no such thing as division of mandates of humanitarian and development organizations when we are discussing displacement. Why? Because of the scale, because of the duration, and because of the fact that displacement largely affects countries that are aspiring for development. In other words, low-income, middle-income countries. I am very fortunate in a way because I was with the World Bank, and then I got the job that impacted me as a person most profoundly, being a humanitarian commissioner. It actually made me a very humble person, because what I have seen is this incredible increase of the footprint of conflicts and natural disasters, and sometimes both of them combined, in a way that is just dramatically transforming countries, individuals, and actually is a huge strain on our collective consciousness. I sit right next to the minister for fourth time. Every time I'm with you, I actually feel kind of embarrassed, because the problem is getting bigger and bigger, and we are playing catch up. The numbers are getting bigger. They're so big that, as David said, it's very difficult to put your hands around them. What does it mean to have 1.1 million Syrians, kids to go to school, and people hoping for homes and jobs? What does it mean? So let me get straight to what does it mean for us at the World Bank. And actually, I'm very happy to be back at the bank after having been a humanitarian commissioner, so I can join David and say, this division is meaningless. We are all dealing with a very massive problem. So for the bank, it means three things. One, we no more are stuck to following the countries rather than the people in need when we are talking about concessional finance. It used to be that we are grounded in income per capita. If your country is at that level of income per capita, you have concessional finance. If you have gotten richer, you don't. But if you follow the people in need, in other words, the 1.1 million Syrians that are now in Jordan, what is the meaning of income per capita for Jordan? So we have created the concessional finance facility to be able to bring the cost of our loans down to concessional terms. And we have done 700 million of concessional finance for Jordan and Lebanon. And of course, we have to do more. We have to do more. Second, we are now working seamlessly with the humanitarian community in providing access to social services, identifying where people are so these services can follow. We are bringing a combination of skills in a way that makes us actually stronger in the face of what is going to be, unfortunately, still a growing problem. The humanitarian community has a high tolerance for risk. People are where bullets are flying. I was one of them. And that high tolerance for risk means eyes and ears and hands, helping hands on the ground. The development community brings better understanding of longer-term trends, better capacity to link data to economic thinking, what actually David demonstrated very ably of doing himself, but we have the systematic approach to data that can turn into solutions. And, frankly speaking, a bigger financial muscle. Why would this muscle not be used for people at risk of dying because of a conflict? Of course it has to be used. And 3, what we bring is the ability to actually translate what is an individual country problem into a global, kind of present it at the global stage. What we did with the Global Finance Facility was to turn it from initially a MENA facility, now the minister may not like that because it was just for Jordan and Lebanon, into really global, because what we are saying is, wait a minute, what we are talking about is the provision of a global public good. Hosting the refugees is, of course, morally right, and of course a neighborly act, but it is serving the whole world. And guess what? The problem is now there, but tomorrow it may be somewhere else. And actually, tomorrow is already today, and the problem is in Uganda. Because of the famine in South Sudan and the conflict of South Sudan, Uganda is seeing a huge increase of displaced populations. So what we want to say to the world is, it is not charity, it is an investment in stability and security. And we as taxpayers in different places, we have an obligation to our own children, to our own countries, to pay for Jordan. And pay we must.
Wow, okay, thank you. Some great initial thoughts there from everybody. So just picking up on one thing you said, Kristalina Georgieva, the division is meaningless. There has been this division in the past. Compacts, as suggested in the report, envisages one solution. What I'd like to get a sense of from all of you panelists is, Minister Fakouri, maybe you can tell us what impact the compact that you guys did has had, and also other panelists, what are the other solutions that we need to find? Or, what's holding back? What does the international community need to do to come up with new and different innovative tools that sit in this gap as well? Minister, why don't you start?
Sure. I want to emphasize something that everyone is looking at. Why is this different this round or this time around? And I really have to mention a few things, and I mean it in the most humble way when I state these things. I think what was very different about what we tried to do this time, one was the scale of the crisis we're dealing with. This is one of the worst humanitarian crises since World War II. I mean, think about what's happening. There's close to 5 million refugees, 8 million displaced people, close to 500,000 people have been killed, close to 90,000 industrial facilities destroyed in Syria, 2.3 million homes out of 4. I don't want to go on and go on. You can find the numbers. The devastation, the scale of devastation is unseen for a very, very long time. The second thing I think that's very critical is what Jordan has pioneered and our national ownership of this. And I think my colleagues recall this very carefully. We have not been silent. We have been the ones in Jordan pounding the international community, demanding that they catch up with what we're trying to do. And I think everybody recognized that over the past few years if you've been following up with everything that has been happening in Jordan. The first one started in a letter I sent to President Gim on March 2015, where I said very clearly that in the Jordan case, given the size and the numbers I mentioned to you, if we don't get access to significant concessionary financing, and let me remind everyone, these are loans that the country is incurring. That's not free money, we're paying it back. But if we're left to borrow at the rates that we're being forced to borrow, so our Euro bonds today are 6.5% to 7%, because for the first time in 25 years, I come back to counter the point of David in a positive way. I start with the macroeconomy because the refugees are part of this economy. If the macroeconomy collapses, everyone loses out. So the starting point has to start at the macroeconomy, the growth. If we don't grow the economic pie, I can do more for refugees. So what we did is very simple. We went and said, in the past 5 years, for the first time in 25 years, our debt to GDP started to go back up from the lower 60s up to 94% last year. That's not because we mismanaged the economy. That's because we did the right thing. We kept the borders open. We absorbed a lot of people. And we did it because that's what Jordan historically does. I remind everyone here that 43% of people living in Jordan as a ratio to Jordanians happen to be registered refugees with UNHCR or UNRWA. This is 2.8 million people. This is the #1 country in absolute number or as a percentage of the population that has registered refugees. I'm not adding another 650,000 unregistered Syrian refugees, hundreds of thousands of economic migrants from Egypt, 200,000 Iraqis that remain in Jordan over the past 20 years from the successive wars and conflicts that have happened there, 30,000 Yemenis, 30,000 Libyans, and so on and so on. So the starting point is we set the first precedent of let the money follow the refugees, not the classification of the country.
Yep.
And President Kim worked very hard with us and with the donors to change that thinking. And we did it. We set a precedent. We started the concessionary financing facility, and we were very glad that it became global because we always felt proud in Jordan that we're setting the precedent, we're doing the pilot, but let this become a global practice. I'll mention one thing on that. It's still not being funded sufficiently. So we made a success story. It's being funded very slowly and not front-loaded and not at the scale. It has to be in the hundreds of millions if we are to get the necessary resources to support Jordan and Lebanon cover the financing gap. The second precedent that we did is we changed the rules of origin with the EU. And that's a critical one because that's a middle-income country accessing rules of origin that have been offered to either countries for the first time because we have the refugees. That was very difficult. It took us all year to negotiate this very hard to get that second precedent to work successfully. And I think that the third level of the paradigm shift we did was to think of education, livelihood, and close the circle. So Jordan told the international community, told the UN agencies, told everyone that's playing in this field, we have a plan. It's called the Jordan Compact, a holistic approach that is trying to connect the growth, trying to allow Syrians to work in an economy, but that has to grow, that has to attract investment, that has to have new market access in order for us to provide work permits. And we were very cautious and careful to have no lost Syrian generation left behind. Yep. So we were very rigorous about pushing Syrian boys and girls to go into education because we don't want on our clock, within our geography, that we make that mistake and we lose that. The results are over 90% of the Syrian boys and girls in Jordan are now in public schools, formal, informal education or catch-up programs. And we have actually more places than, so it's a situation where the government and the donors are chasing the refugees to put their kids in school. We have issued, as of last week, cumulatively 48,500 work permits to Syrian refugees. No other country around us has done that or come similar, although we're the lowest per capita income country out of Syria's neighbors and in terms of our carrying capacity. And yesterday, I report to you, we had the first factory finally send the first 3 shipments to Spain and Cyprus under the new rules from a factory that employs 15% Syrian refugees. It took us about 8 months to push so hard to educate our own existing manufacturing to start thinking of linking with the European market, which is very different, very difficult. So that was the first time, but again, it's very insufficient to the scale and we need to push this very hard.
Okay, thank you. Kristalina, David, what does the international community need to do to replicate that more quickly and in greater numbers and greater scale?
Well, the first obligation we bear is to relentlessly fundraise for the concessional terms of the assistance we provide to Jordan, to Lebanon, to other countries. And I told the minister that I see this as a very important priority for me. As he knows, when I was in the European Union,
Correct.
I was pretty good in kind of pushing people to come with the money. Then I was the money, and I pushed myself. So
It was an easy one.
I am, and now I feel this obligation. We have raised 350 approximately $1 million as donor funding for the concessional facility. We have set a target of at least $1 billion. So we have, as the minister said, we have some way to go. Because unless we have the financing, we are simply not credible to pursue the compacts more aggressively further. Secondly, we have to be very diligent in looking at the refugee population and the host community. And do programs and projects that are as much as possible fairly treating both. There is always the risk to get carried away by the legitimate aspirations of the refugee populations, and then treat them better than we treat the local communities in our programs. And that is very detrimental to the host communities' openness, and actually may create a very dangerous backlash. So by doing good, we may actually create very bad unintended consequences. And the third lesson in my mind is to be very persistent on working with those who are there in a collaborative manner. We at the World Bank are hosting, actually co-hosting with European Investment Bank, breakfast of the development banks that have programs related to migration and forced displacement. So we can look at what we do collectively, and of course, working with the humanitarian community to make sure that the whole is bigger than the sum of individual parts. I am the first to admit that working in a multi-organizational fashion is not an easy thing. We are all human, and sometimes we look at the other guys and we say, they slow us down. You know, if I do it on my own, it would be faster. Maybe faster, but not as sustainable and effective as it would be if we work all together. So these are three things. Get the money, be serious about it, make sure that we treat refugees and host communities fairly, equally, and accept the fact that no institution is good enough to do it on its own.
It's such a privilege to listen to these two real stars of the humanitarian development world. I can honestly say I think I've learned more from the two of them over the last 3 years than listening to anyone else. And I don't want to add to the policy agenda that they've laid out here. It seems to me completely compelling. I just want to make one different point, not about policy, but about politics. Because I think it's actually a bigger political problem that we've got than a policy problem. And I just want to take a moment to try and explain one aspect of the political problem. It seems to me that the most difficult part of the politics of all this is that the refugees we're talking about are leaving Syria in this case, let's be specific, they're leaving for a long time. And it's a slightly unfair word to use, but the fiction that is quite convenient to a lot of the players in this field is that they're being displaced for a short time. Fiction's a hard word to use, but Minister Fukuri will know what I'm saying when I say that it's a big thing to say to your own population that these people are going to stay. And it's also a big thing in the donor community to say, we don't just have to pay for this for 1 year, bank on paying it for, well, if they've been out for 7 years, we're looking at 15 or 20 years. Yep. And it seems to me that the politics of the long-term nature of this displacement are, in a way, even more difficult than the policy requirements of long-term displacement. The policy requirements of long-term displacement are, you've got to get the adults into work, you've got to get the kids into school, you've got to share the benefits with the local population, you've got to address the infrastructure issues. And Jordan is a country at relative peace, it's not at war like Syria, so actually it's a policy problem that's manageable, and the only way they can do it is with massive international economic support. It needs organizations like the World Bank to do it. That's the policy agenda, and any of us who've been in the policy world can see the different moving parts and the tensions. The politics, though, for the donor countries to the World Bank and others, and for internal management within Jordan, the politics is really hard for all concerned. And it's obviously especially hard at a time when, in the so-called industrialized Western advanced world, there is a great danger that in saying that charity begins at home, we actually end up saying charity ends at home, which is a familiar danger in politics today. And it's obviously a real challenge for you, because the question of, well, how long is long term raises very difficult questions. I'm sure there are representatives here from Lebanon. If anything, it raises even more difficult questions in a country that hasn't had a census since 1931 because of issues that arise by the confessional differences that exist within the country. And I think in a forum like this, it's important to register that this political standoff around the question of the long-term nature of displacement is really important. What I would pitch to global leaders who are coming to the World Bank meetings, the spring meetings, is that it's impossible for the hosting countries to make the move unless the first move comes from the donor countries. And only if the hosting countries can present a win-win is it conceivable that they can begin to front up to their own populations the nature of the structural challenge here. And so for all that I say, not just when Kristalina is in hearing distance, that the World Bank is the most dynamic player on the humanitarian scene over the last 3 years, the most welcome, new and innovative presence. I fear that the politics of this are that we're going to have to go radically further to really get into any kind of place where the problem doesn't just get bigger and bigger in the Jordans of this world. And I just listening to the policy discussion that happens, I think it's important that we recognize that these issues are policy and politics together. Now, that's obviously true in terms of the refugee resettlement question in countries like this, which is relatively small part of the equation in numbers terms, but a big part of the equation in symbolic terms, because if countries like this start saying, well, we're not taking Syrian refugees, that has big symbolic importance. But there's also this fundamental point that, to all my estimates, looking at the civil wars that are raging around the world, not just in the Middle East, they are long-term problems. And the fiction that they're short-term problems is completely disabling for our ability to address them.
Kristalina.
Well, listening to David, what I hear is that what we need is a very massive dose of common sense. And we know that especially...
Thank goodness the British have brought common sense to this discussion.
That unfortunately, especially in politics, it seems to me that the most common thing about common sense, not very common. And what we do about that, I think, is not a very easy thing. But this is why we have you. The Center for Global Development has been notorious for speaking truth to power. And I think we would all benefit from these kinds of partnerships that stick it in our face. That's reality. Face it.
Okay, well, at the risk of sticking it in your face, before we move to questions from the audience and online, I'd like to just get a quick answer from all of you about what are your institutions and organizations and agencies going to do differently or going to do more of in the future to make sure that we create more of these innovative solutions like compacts that live in this gap that needs to be bridged? Christina, why don't you begin?
Partner more with the countries that are experiencing the problems, with the organizations that are there. Partner more, be open to learn from others, and then integrate that learning. And actually, I would add one more thing. Being able to accept that in uncharted territory, we might make a mistake and then able to correct it. Like the mistake we made in the beginning of this crisis, all of us, was to pretend that the solution is around the corner. Remember, Assad must go, Assad is bad, Assad must go, Assad will go. And that, I think this is very important, very, very important to be able to admit if we are wrong, we got it wrong, we need to get it right.
Minister Fakhouri.
Together.
I'm going to be practical and pragmatic because we're living with the repercussions of this, and you see Jordan very active on the global scene to lobby hard for all that needs to change. We've set all the precedents that are really unprecedented, whether the new rules of origin, whether the concessionary financing facility. But for us, for me as a Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, we live day by day to leave no stone unturned. What I mean by that, we're trying to figure out every possible thing that we can derive value or benefit from to enable us to sustain our resilience whilst at the same time making sure we don't lose the prosperity of our own as citizens. So what we're focused on right now is we have the first compact that's being piloted that's truly, fully a compact. We pushed hard to hold the Brussels event that you've seen 1 year from London to make sure that we take stock of what happened the first year. We push the international community to sustain. We look at the lessons learned, and we continue to work together as partners, but through a process that's nationally owned and nationally led, which is very critical. And we are doing things across the board. So the recommendations actually are right on the dot. So I'll tell you something that amazed me when I started this. We were chasing donors who usually tell local governments be transparent to figure out where they're putting their resources in. We've had so many players in the field, and we have a saying in Arabic, الزحام يعيق الحركة, which means congestion blocks movement. So we have so many people in the field that we were forcing, pushing, shouting the players to kindly coordinate, to kindly, transparently state what they're funding in which areas so we understand how to maximize impact. We started to do these response plans that are based on what David had said and what the authors have said, doing comprehensive vulnerability assessments at the micro level. What are the needs of the refugees based on CVAs in the host communities, inside the camps? What are the needs of the host communities? And then put these plans together in a prioritized way with the help of all the donors, with the help of all the UN agencies in a very collaborative, participatory approach, but forcing the discipline to be coordinated and to be transparent in putting everything on the table, the data, and doing that all needs to be done. And we moved to incentivize the right systems. So we are issuing work permits free of charge. We're doing flexible work permits in sectors where we have high foreign workers so that we actually can use the Syrian employment to stop importing new labor into the country, so to create a win-win scenario. We're doing home-based joint businesses. We're working with international companies like IKEA and others to create a consortium of firms that would place orders in private sector set-up facilities that would employ both Jordanians and Syrians, which is very important because these are the things that give us more ability to breathe, survive, until we resolve both the policies and the politics of this issue going forward.
Okay.
So my final message is invest in the right models. And you have a very good model in this case. I believe Lebanon is trying also its best to do another good model. I think invest in it, incentivize it, and then you can replicate this successfully. And Kristalina, I remember the cost of supporting refugees in host countries that neighbor Syria will go up 10 to 20 times once they cross the Mediterranean and reach, Europe and beyond. So think also common sense. You could do a little bit more now and save yourself tremendous amounts of costs and hopefully minimize the loss of hope and possibly radicalization and other things.
Okay, Minister, thank you, David.
One thing we're going to do very, very briefly, encapsulated in 3 numbers, 6, 11, 25. 6% is the percentage of the international humanitarian budget globally that goes on cash distribution. 11% is the percent of the IRC's $720 million that goes on cash distribution. 25% is the target that we've set ourselves for the percent of cash distribution by 2020, year 5 of our strategic plan, that will go in cash distribution. I think that's a way to empower refugees, and our study in Lebanon shows that it also has effects on intimate partner violence and school attendance. But it's also a way to boost the local economy, because the same study in Lebanon showed that for every $100 you give to a refugee, $216 circulates in the local economy because people are paying rent and buying food, etc.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's a silver bullet, this cash thing. Obviously not literally, it doesn't have to literally be wads of cash, cash-based payments. Could really be transformative, and probably the most transformative thing over the shortest period, if we really embrace that as an international humanitarian sector.
And we actually do that. We have, what I mean is we do connect, we have the objectives of financial inclusion that are there to provide the incentive for more assistance to go in cash.
Hasn't reached us yet, so we need to have a side meeting about how to get that motoring.
Okay, we can facilitate that. Okay, I'm going to open up to some questions and comments from the floor. We have a couple of microphones going around. If I call on you, I'm going to ask you to wait till the microphone gets to you, to stand up, say your name, your affiliation, and then I'm going to ask you to give a brief, very brief comment if you have a comment to give, and then move to a question. I am, first of all, going to ask Amal here, who is Special Advisor to the Prime Minister of Lebanon, to very briefly give us the Lebanese perspective on the compacts that you've done.
Thank you. My name is Amal Mudallali, and I'm advisor for Prime Minister Hariri. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for all the good work you've been doing on this project. And my apologies also, because the Minister of Refugees was supposed to be here and he couldn't make it at the last minute. As you all know, that Lebanon was slow in responding to this problem, and I can't tell you what the problems is, because you know all the problems in Lebanon. Some are political, as you mentioned, and others are economic, and others we can't even mention. I just have a quick question for Mr. Miliband. You were just in Lebanon and you met Mr. Hariri, and I just would like to know, because the government has started really a program of doing the right things, hopefully, on this issue. In your opinion, what are the Lebanese doing right? What they're not doing right, and what can they do better? And this also for Ms. Kristalina, and for the Minister from Jordan, what lessons from Jordan do you have for the Lebanese? Thank you.
Okay, those are probably quite good concluding comments, so we might save those until the end,
sure.
I think. Let's get a couple more, actually. Let's get that lady there, and then was there somebody in the middle section? That lady there. Yeah, I'll take these 2 questions and we'll get some responses.
Hello, my name is Diana Cayley. I'm an advisor of food security and monitoring, evaluation, and learning with Crown Agents USA. So I worked on a community development program, a USAID-funded program in Iraq, based in Kirkuk in 2010. And what I saw was a big disconnect between what was happening at the national level and the community groups and local councils that we were working with there. And so now 3 out of 4 refugees are in cities. It seems like a new model potentially could be to work at the city level, but I see this being potentially quite problematic, because the politics and policies at the national level versus at the especially the secondary city level can be difficult. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, and then there was a lady here, wasn't there?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Bethel. I'm a recent grad from SOAS in London in migration and development. So I guess piggybacking off of the the motif of division that we've been talking about, but to kind of change it a little bit. I think it's awesome the work that you all are pushing to do in terms of closing that gap between humanitarian and development work, but I'm wondering what focus, if any, that you all in your organizations are thinking about in terms of closing divisions between refugee communities and host communities, because as we know, and as America is an example of, it's not quite enough to serve communities in fact, but also rhetorically, they, you know, development and humanitarian work, it's service work. So if people don't feel, if there's still that divide, rhetorically, if people are still split politically, then you know, it kind of becomes moot. And we see things like people working and voting against their interests. Obviously, there's a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric in America. And so I'm just wondering if you are doing anything toward that.
Great question. Thank you very much. Minister, why don't we start with you?
I'll focus on most likely the lessons learned, and I'll throw a challenge to both IRC and CDG to think about what I've been as a minister in a host country that is impacted by this, telling the international community we need to think of. I think on the lessons side, I believe we're going to have to do annual events like London, like Brussels, to sustain the momentum, whether we like it or not, because something else shifts. Two, the way we do the aid very much and the compact, you have to have a holistic approach. If you don't, it's going to crash. It will definitely crash because you won't be able to balance the host community needs with the refugee needs, with the macroeconomic and fiscal stability of the country. I mean, those are very critical. So in our case, we're doing a second successive IMF program, which is a very difficult program, both austerity, fiscally, and structural reforms. And we're hosting all these refugees. And we're at the forefront of fighting extremism and terrorism across very serious borders that have nobody across from our side except, you know, potential terrorists and other things hitting the border from different locations. So I understand that constraint. But key is we have, over the past 3 years, pushed very hard the international community and donors to move to maximize aid through cash to refugees, because that adds value to the local economy. We have been pushing INGOs and UN agencies and donors to maximize buying goods and services and delivering their aid from the local economy. We have been also pushing them, and we reached close to 90% now doing that, and we're pushing the cash program very well. We're also asking them to maximize using national capacity. So in Brussels, we came up with a Jordan output document and the Lebanon output document, where we committed to continuing our commitments in the Jordan Compact, the Lebanon Compact that was in London, but we also put pressure on the international community to adjust and continue their commitments vis-a-vis that compact relationship, so we do a better job together at delivering what we need. One final point I mentioned, I think on bridging the humanitarian development divide, I call it close the circle. I think we have to deal with a very critical issue, which is how you register a refugee, how do you give that refugee cash? Can you then incentivize the refugee that you give them cash and help that they have to put their kids in school? And then can you also figure out through the employment hubs we're working on with the ILO, with IRC and others, can I place them into jobs that I need in the economy rather than letting them just continue to work in the informal sector, which could be displacing nationals, which could then break down the social cohesion between host communities and so on. So you connect the circle of registering a refugee, placing their kids in school, the livelihood and the job aspects, and you incentivize that circle to close correctly. I believe if we don't do this and find ways, maybe not to force it, but to incentivize this in the right way, I think then we're going to run out of into a serious problem of sustaining a success of this limited success we've seen in these compacts.
Okay, Kristalina Georgieva, lessons learned from the compact that you've been involved in.
The two probably most important lessons we learned is one, don't try to perfect the compact because conditions would keep changing. Bring some parameters that are sufficient to define objectives in how you measure progress, so you know that money is delivering, but don't try to be cross all the T's and dot all the I's, because reality will keep changing.
Correct.
And two, build relations at all levels with the government, but then of course at the community level, the places where action is, because that would help to make the compact more adaptive and adjustable, but also would help to bring some degree of trust, without which we always risk to end up in the zone of finger pointing. I don't know whether the minister would agree, but I think we have been quite good this time around to actually build that kind of inclusiveness at all levels as the foundation for trust.
Shall I address the question from Her Excellency? I mean, I felt very lucky to spend some time with the Prime Minister when I was in Lebanon. I felt that most noticeable was his determination to have some real grip on this refugee issue, a strong sense that there'd been a long period of in which more progress could have been made. From our point of view, we work significantly on the employment side in Lebanon, on protection for women and kids is a major issue, also on some education work. We're not actually doing health work generally in Lebanon. And maybe I'll just take one example. I certainly won't tell you what you're doing wrong. That would be way beyond the levels of diplomacy, but maybe an area where there's something going well and something that could be done better. Obviously, Lebanon has a smaller population than Jordan and has more Syrian refugees than Jordan. So it really is in a monumentally challenging situation. You've put a lot of effort, and the former minister was very committed to this, to expand the state education system. And you've got 200,000 kids in second shift, but there are still 250,000 kids who are not in education. In the most humble way, I hope, I would submit, and I tried to say to the Prime Minister, that the only way to bridge this is to see what we would call community-based education, non-formal education, not as somehow a threat, but as a complement to the state education system. I think the fastest way to eat into that extraordinarily challenging 200,000 person, 200,000 child group is a dramatic expansion of community-based non-formal education. Obviously, I know that there have been concerns about how do we know what curriculum is used, how can we be sure, but I honestly believe that the dangers, and I use the word advisedly, of having 250,000 children with effectively no education far outweigh the dangers that might exist from a properly organized, community-based education system. As it happens, we're helping about 3,500 Syrian kids in Lebanon with community-based education. And 7,000, we're a partner of the Lebanese Education Ministry in providing social and emotional learning for kids who are on the second shift and are learning literacy and numeracy in the second shift, but they're not getting the social and emotional support. We're helping them as well. But the fastest way to ramp up that 3,500 number is to significantly expand non-formal education. This is challenging for donors who prefer to give money to the state education system, and it's challenging for the state. I do understand that. But I honestly believe if you mobilize our efforts and those of other agencies, there would be a dramatic improvement. On my last visit, sorry to go on about it, but it really is important. In an informal settlement in Bekaa Valley, I went and saw the education provision that we're providing today in a tent, 2 tents in fact, compared to what we were doing. I went to the same settlement 2 years ago. And I think if you went, or if the Prime Minister or one of his other advisors went, you'd be so impressed by how these children are getting social and emotional support as well as proper, sort of more formal teaching in this very informal setting where practically no money has been spent on buildings, where for every Lebanese teacher there's a Syrian refugee who's also been brought in as a teacher, and you have real double, triple, quadruple dividend. And so if I could inspire you to really think about a massive expansion of non-formal education, I think you could really make a profound difference really quite fast on that.
Okay, so just on that point, and Alice Albright, you had your hand up. Do you want to make ask a question quickly? We'll wait for a microphone to come to you. Then we'll get one from Raj Kumar from DevEx. And then a gentleman from Al Hurra, did you want to ask a question? Did you want to ask a question later on or not? Maybe later. Okay, maybe.
Thank you. My name's Alice Albright. I work at the Global Partnership for Education. It's been a delight to be in the study group with this gang over here. I've really enjoyed it. We spent a lot of time talking about Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, obviously for obvious reasons. And I think that a lot of the policy prescriptions that you've mentioned, I think, are very, very relevant. But when you zoom out a little bit, there are millions and millions of refugees and displaced people elsewhere in the world. And in thinking about how we allocate policy and financial resources, I often wonder how you draw the balance between looking at situations where refugees and displaced people have gone to versus the original circumstances from which they've come. And I'd love to get, I've really enjoyed all the comments you've made, how the world's policymakers ought to look at the issues in the countries of origin. Syria is obviously a special case, but many countries in Africa, for example, where people are fleeing because the circumstances from which they are fleeing hold no opportunity and no hope, and it's something that we spend time on. But I'd love to hear what you think about that. And let me again thank CGD for doing, once again, a fantastic job on getting into a very, very important issue.
Thank you. Raj Kumar, let's get a question from you.
Well, congratulations on this fantastic report, and congratulations, too, on getting through an entire panel without mentioning Brexit or Trump or Le Pen. I guess I've just gone and done that. But to that point, I guess we are at OECD says 2016 is the highest year ever for overseas development assistance. And it's likely that high may not be repeated anytime soon. So given those circumstances, I just offer one additional idea to the conversation, which is the importance of efficiency, finding ways to make the dollars go further. And I think if there's anything that might bridge this long-running divide, decades-long divide between the humanitarian and development aspects of our work, it could be technology. And you've seen this in our reporting on DevEx, but we think we're right at the tipping point where many of the people we're talking about will be connected to the internet, will be ID'd biometrically, will have access to financial services. And so a lot of the things that the minister just talked about, providing conditional cash transfer for education or cash when people need it in an emergency, that ultimately might be technology that shifts the way we work toward a more retail-oriented industry from a more wholesale one, divided into silos. So I submit that idea for your consideration and to all of you, and thank you and congratulations on a great piece of work.
Okay, let's get a couple of responses to those. I think we may run out of time for any more questions after that. Let's start with a question from Alice Albright. How do you balance the difference in circumstances between where refugees came from and where they end up? Would you like to take that on?
Well, it's slightly my former life, but I think you're so right to call out the crisis of peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping. The fact that civil wars are lasting, there are more civil wars and they're lasting longer. The new David Armitage book goes through the statistics, does represent a crisis of peacemaking and peacekeeping. And I think that there are a couple of points that really trouble me. One is that no amount of military effort, development effort, or diplomatic effort will work without clarity about what political settlement will underpin state stability. And actually Lebanon is a great example of that in the end, unless every community has a stake in the system of governance, then you're asking for long-term trouble. And I really fear, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also across significant numbers of the African countries that you, I think, had in mind, that there's a crisis of governance and a crisis of legitimate governance that is really very, very significant. And that is not there's no short-term answer to that. But the truth is, as long as that crisis of peacemaking and peace building is continuing, we're always going to be running up the downward escalator in the humanitarian sector. I don't have any quick answers on that, but I do think this point that you can't kill your way out of these crises, you can't develop your way out of these crises, you can't just negotiate the way out of these crises unless you have that vision of a political settlement. And frankly, my view of the Syria crisis, or one view of the Syria crisis, is that from the beginning, that's been the hole in the middle of this diplomatic effort. What is the political settlement? It's all very well to say that there's a transition from the Assad regime, but what's it to? And unless you can answer that question, then I foresee really longer and longer of the civil wars. Now, it's easier to describe the problem than it is to provide the answer, but often what we do, especially on the military side, but not only, exacerbates the problem because it's not actually taking place within a political context. And I think that is my biggest learning from Afghanistan, from Iraq, over the last 20 years, but actually if you think about it, it is common sense. Just while I've got the floor, your point, Raj, about efficiency, I just want to make 2 points about that. One, let's talk about cost effectiveness, not just cost efficiency. One of the points in the report is, we say on our website 92 cents of every dollar goes to the front line, to programs, which is great, but the question we should be being asked is, well, what are you getting? Now, as it happens, we're developing our own tool to benchmark different activities in different countries to see how much do different things cost, and why does it cost more to deliver a women's protection service in one part of the world than another? Because I think that's part of our drive for impact. Secondly, and very, very difficult, the donors are going to have to fess up about where the money's going within their own systems, as well as demanding transparency from us about where the money goes in our systems. Because although it's convenient for a donor to say, of the $1 million we're giving you, tell us where it's all going, there's a prior question, which is, hang on, before you gave us $1 million, you had $1.5 million or 1.x million dollars. And so I think the demand for transparency in the grand bargain, which Kristalina was absolutely pivotal. My fear about the grand bargain is that she's not there driving it forward anymore. But this transparency thing is very, very difficult. But in the end, without it, we're not going to be able to drive the efficiency through the system. The political difficulty is that it's going to expose some very, very difficult questions for people to answer. And playing that through, I think, is going to be a real job. The fact that Antonio Guterres is talking so clearly about UN reform, I think, is very healthy and very, very positive.
Okay. In the interest of squeezing one tiny last
Sorry,
question
I spoke too
in,
long.
I'm going to just ask this gentleman here, just wait for a microphone to come to you, sir. Can you grab a microphone? And that will be the last one. And panelists, you can keep your comments concise. That will be appreciated.
Thanks. Martin Herman, State Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. I realize I don't look like a diplomat, but I just got off a plane, so apologies for that.
I'm glad you were wearing your tie on the plane.
No, let me begin by thanking CGD and ICC for what I think is an absolutely excellent report. And I think it's encouraging how the policy discussion on the humanitarian development nexus has moved over the last couple of years. It's really taken over. I think that's fantastic. Doesn't mean the work is done. I want to recognize the panel also for what you're doing individually, but also I think for the organizations and the country that you represent. I mean, you're part of making sure that this is actually a new way of working, not just a new way of talking. I mean, because the reality is we need to operationalize this. And I think the discussion here has moved in a number of ways over the last couple of years. First of all, it's moved from being what was essentially a humanitarian conversation first, to be a conversation that was a humanitarian and a development conversation. I think that's a job well done. It's moved also from being a discussion that was primarily about refugees or displaced people to be a discussion about refugees, displaced, and host communities. But there's a third element that's lacking. This is primarily still a discussion amongst multilateral and international agencies. And we need to make sure it's also a discussion with bilateral agencies. Because if we are to gear and put in motion, put in work, the resources out there, we need to get the bilateral agencies on board. And when I say agencies, not donors, it is a very conscious decision, because the reality is there's a tendency to talk about bilateral agencies as donors, those with checks. But the reality is that bilateral donors, like my own, like Danita, we're not only those with the checks, we are also out there on the front line in the field implementing programs. And if you want to change the way that humanitarian agencies work, if you want to change the way that development agencies work, you need to get the bilateral agencies on board, not only as part of a policy discussion involving the multilateral field, but as a policy discussion involving themselves. So the quick question to the panel is, how do you see that discussion going?
Okay, 30 seconds, panelists.
So, are you looking at me to be the first to? The inclusiveness does reach out to bilateral agencies. They are part of this grant bargain. And what we are conscious of is that the pressure has to stay on all of us. I'm glad you're here, and all I can say is, may we have more Danes, or to broaden it, more Nordics, because you guys have been, from the bilateral side, the most prudent to come on board. So if I may put the monkey back on your back, stay in this expanded circle. And may I say something just for Lebanon, if I may, to your question. When you bring the kids, don't forget to pay more attention that the girls are in. Because if they're not, they would go marry early or worse. Yeah. So look after the girls. And this being said, for Lebanon, for Jordan, we only have a word of gratitude for what you do. All of us. Thank you. So pass that message back. We are grateful. All of us in the world.
Okay, I think that's probably a good point to wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment I'm going to invite you to enjoy some light refreshments out the back. I'm also going to ask you to stay seated while the panelists depart the stage. But I would also like you to give them a round of applause to say thank you very much for joining us. Amanda will help you with your
Thanks.